Hello, I am Dr. Lawrence Smith, Dean of the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. Thank you for tuning in to Well Said. In a culture of community, scholarship, and innovation, the Zucker School of Medicine is dedicated to transforming students into doctors who will improve healthcare, inspire change, and better the lives of the people they serve. It is why we are pleased to collaborate with WRHU Radio Hofstra University to bring you a program committed to sharing expert discussion and insight on health and wellness topics important to you. Join us today and each week for a recommended dose of Well Said with your host, Dr. Ira Nash.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ira Nash. Welcome to Well Said. With the warmer weather and sunshine we've been experiencing in recent weeks, we'll be discussing the importance of sun safety. My guest is my colleague, Dr. Michael Dannenberg. Dr. Dannenberg is the Chief of Dermatology at Huntington Hospital and a Fellow of the American Academy of Dermatology, and I'm delighted that he's my guest today on Well Said. Michael, welcome to Well Said.
Thank you, Ira.
So I said in the intro, weather's been nice. We're all getting outside a bit more. Why is it important to be mindful of our sun exposure?
With the increased sun exposure, there's going to be more changes to the skin. I equate this with, sort of the crash course that everybody's had recently during the COVID pandemic. We know that as the coronavirus multiplies, it forms mutations. And with each mutation, there are different strains that evolve. Likewise, with more sun exposure, we're getting more mutations in our skin. The cells of the skin form mutations, and some of those mutations can cause cancerous changes. So the goal here is to really limit the amount of exposure that people have to minimize the chance of having a cancerous mutation in the skin.
So this is a lot more than just avoiding a painful sunburn.
Yes, it is. In fact, we know that we do want people to avoid a burn, but we're talking also about the total accumulation of ultraviolet light that you accumulate over a lifetime.
How do you balance that need to protect us from this accumulated damage to the skin that could lead to skin cancer? How do you balance that against some of the benefits of sun exposure? We all need a little bit of sunlight, don't we?
We sure do. And let's face it, most people feel really good when they've been out in the sun for a while. And so we never tell people that they have to live in the basement. I think that living or being outside, an outdoor lifestyle is part of a healthy lifestyle. But there are good ways to do that and not so good ways to do it. So going out early in the day, going out later in the day, using sunscreens, that all will help prevent some of that accumulated sun exposure. In terms of vitamin D production, vitamin D is produced in the skin, but your skin doesn't make vitamin D the entire time that you're out in the sun. It makes vitamin D for a short period of time, and then it stops. And so really getting 15 minutes of unprotected sun exposure a day is adequate for vitamin D production. After that, people should cover up.
How much skin do you actually have to expose to get the vitamin D production? Is your face enough? Do you have to take your shirt off?
Different parts of the body produce different amounts of vitamin D. You can expose your backside all day long. You're going to make very, very little vitamin D.
You're not going to make a lot of friends either.
But if you expose your face and your forearms, you'll make much more. Face, the forearms, and your trunk is adequate for producing vitamin D.
As long as we're on sort of the beneficial effects of the sun, limited as they may be, what do you make of the psychological aspects of being out in the sun?
Very uplifting. That's what I always say is part of a healthy lifestyle. I go out biking, I go hiking, golfing. I love going to the beach. But again, I think that you can do that and get the enjoyment of being out in the sun without overexposing. Using a sunscreen, wearing a hat, being out early in the day or later in the day, avoiding that peak sun exposure between 11 and 3 when the sun damage is really the worst. I like the idea. I tell patients to have a Spanish-style siesta midday. Get out of the heat of the day and go out earlier and later when you can enjoy that sunlight without getting as much sun damage.
Do you still derive the benefits of vitamin D production at those off hours?
You will. Again, you want to try to find balance there, and if you find that somebody's very low on vitamin D, if they've seen their internist and they've told them that they're low on vitamin D, you may want to get 15 minutes during the midday. But for most people, if you have exposure 10 o'clock or 4:30, 5 o'clock in the late afternoon, you will be producing vitamin D.
Are there people who should be particularly mindful of the advice that you just gave about limiting their sun exposure?
Absolutely. Some people are definitely at higher risk. People who are lighter skinned are certainly at higher risk of getting a skin cancer. So if you have really light Northern European type skin, it's a risk factor and you need to be more cautious. That doesn't mean that people who have darker skinned are immune to it. They still need to be cautious, but they're not as likely to burn. People with a history of skin cancer or a family history of skin cancer need to be extra cautious. Anybody who is immunosuppressed, especially organ transplant patients, should be very, very cautious about sun exposure. People who are on or have a recent history of chemotherapy should be especially cautious in using very high-numbered sunscreens. And finally, people who are on some medications that can make them more sensitive to the sun. Common medications like hydrochlorothiazide and tetracycline, doxycycline, amiodarone are all medications that can increase one's sensitivity to the sun. And so these patients really should be more cautious. Most of the time when patients get a prescription, there'll be a label on the bottle from the pharmacist saying, beware of sun protection.
What's the connection between immune system disorders and chemotherapy and more sun sensitivity?
The theory is that all of us develop cancer every day, and that our immune system is particularly good at finding these abnormal cells and killing them. When we are immunosuppressed, when we're on chemotherapy, we're lowering the functioning of that immune system, and therefore some of those potential cancers that are coming up are missed, and that's what allows these to grow. You take the transplant patients, they have a huge problem with squamous cell carcinomas, almost epidemic for them. It's very hard for them to control the growth of that particular cell line given the immunosuppressants that they're on.
That's interesting. So you mentioned a particular kind of skin cancer, and I think it's probably worth taking a minute in the context of talking about sun damage to the skin to talk about the fact that there are different kinds of skin cancers, some of which are much less worrisome than others. Could you just run through that real quick for us to kind of talk?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, Tara. There are very distinct types of skin cancers that have nothing to do with each other than the fact that they reside in the skin. Basal cell carcinomas are by far the most common form of skin cancer. They do not spread around the body. They stay localized, but they will grow, and they can sometimes cause significant destruction to the skin and adjacent structures from growth. Squamous cell carcinomas likewise come up. They tend to be a little bit more aggressive than basal cell carcinomas. However, in the immunosuppressed population, they can be very aggressive, and people do die from squamous cell carcinomas. And then the most serious type of the more common types of skin cancers are malignant melanomas. And those are dark spots that come up on the skin that will potentially metastasize widely or spread around the body. And that's the most deadly form of skin cancer.
And all of them are potentiated or made more likely to occur by sun exposure?
Yes. With melanomas, for anybody who's had a history of a blistering sunburn, especially as a child, that exposure as a child increases your lifelong risk for developing a melanoma. So sunburns are very significant for melanoma. But for all three skin cancers, the total accumulation of sun exposure that you've had over a lifetime is really what leads to a lot of these. That seems to be the driving force. It's interesting with melanoma because you don't always get the melanoma where you have the blistering sunburn. So the mechanism is somewhat hazy for that. If you have a blistering sunburn as a child, you can develop a melanoma anywhere on your body.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Huh. And is that understood why that is? That you had a terrible sunburn on your back and you get a melanoma on your foot?
No. To my knowledge, they have not uncovered that. But I usually tell patients it's probably in that when you have a blistering sunburn, your skin is sending off some sort of distress signal, and some of those that immune chemicals that are released in that process probably increase that risk of developing a melanoma down the line. But no, you know what? There really hasn't been a lot of evidence showing what the mechanism is for that.
And just to round out our little chamber of horrors here, there are lots of other long-term bad things that can happen to the skin other than cancer from a lot of sun exposure. Is that right?
Yes. You know what? I draw an analogy here to smoking for my patients. We know that people who smoke are more likely to develop a lung cancer, but not everybody gets a lung cancer. But if you smoke enough, you're going to develop emphysema or COPD or some other pulmonary disease. Likewise, for people who get excessive sun exposure, they are a higher risk for developing skin cancer, which they may or may not develop. But clearly, anybody who gets enough sun exposure will develop skin disease. That sort of skin disease includes premature wrinkling of the skin, pigment mottling, light and dark spots that come up on the skin, drying out of the skin, leathering of the skin. All of these changes, which many people equate with getting older, is really not an aging thing. That's strictly sun exposure.
So you talked a little bit about avoiding peak times of the day, covering up, and sunscreen. I want to dive in a little bit more about the sunscreen. What should we be looking for in a sunscreen?
Several qualities. You want to make sure that it has at least an SPF of 30, and you want to make sure that it's broad spectrum. Those are the two most important features. By broad spectrum, I mean that it blocks both UVA and UVB, the two types of ultraviolet light that contribute to skin cancer. Most good sunscreens now are broad spectrum, but you really have to look at the label on the bottle to make sure that it says broad spectrum.
Are there particular ingredients that we should be looking for?
Sunscreens are really broken down into two categories. They're what are called chemical sunscreens or physical blockers, which are the non-chemical sunscreens. Chemical sunscreens, known as oxybenzone, avobenzene, octasalicylate, there's a series of them that all absorb ultraviolet light and prevent it from getting beyond those chemicals into the deeper layers of the skin. Those are very, very effective. They've been around for years. And then the physical blockers are zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, which reflect the sun's light, and they form a layer on the surface of the skin.
Is one preferable or more effective than the other?
No. You know what? They're all good. They're all FDA approved. The FDA has been looking at some of the chemical sunscreens because they do get absorbed into the body. They've yet to find any harmful effects of any of them, so they're all very safe. For those people that are concerned about absorption of the chemicals, the physical blockers do not get absorbed. The only problem with the physical blockers, the zinc oxide and the titanium dioxide, is you can easily get to an SPF of 30 with those and have a fairly elegant preparation. But as you get up to the higher numbers, they get really very pasty. So if somebody wants an SPF of 50 or 70, in order to get that number without a pasty formulation, you really need to have a combination with some of the chemical sunscreens.
I've read, I guess, on the label of the sunscreen that the SPF, that stands for sun protection factor, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
It is roughly equivalent to how many times longer you can stay out in the sun when you have it on than you could without it. Is that a decent rule of
Yes,
thumb?
essentially, if you have an SPF of 15, it means that over the course of 15 hours, you'll have as much absorption of sun as you would in 1 hour of non-protected sun exposure.
Do the numbers really correlate with the numbers on the bottle, so to speak?
The answer to that is not as direct as you think. When they test a sunscreen, because when they put an SPF rating on a sunscreen, they have to test it. And when they go into the lab to test it, the industry standard is to use 1 ounce of sunscreen on the whole body. If you fill up a shot glass with sunscreen, that's an ounce. So that's quite a bit
lot
of
sunscreen.
None of us use that much. And so when we apply sunscreen, we under-apply it. And therefore, we don't get the SPF on our skin that they've measured in the laboratory. And that's why, our goal is really to get people to a sun protective factor of at least a 15. But that's why we recommend using a minimum of a 30, so that when you under-apply it, you're getting close to a 15. If you're putting on a 50, you're getting between a 20 and a 25.
Okay, so that's a very helpful rule of thumb. So here's another question I have two more questions about sunscreen. So is there any real difference between the sort of name brands and the drugstore sunscreen?
Is there a difference between a shirt from Ralph Lauren or a shirt from Target?
Well,
so it is the sunscreens, if they're well labeled and from an honorable manufacturer. No, the name brand ones may be a little bit more elegant, may feel a little bit nicer on the skin. The vehicle may be a better vehicle. But in terms of the sunscreen, assuming that the labeling is accurate, no, that they should all be suitable.
I was recently out at the beach and using my SPF 30 sunscreen, but I noticed that it said on the label that you should apply the sunscreen 15 minutes before sun exposure. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out why that should be the case. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. That's true for the chemical sunscreens, because for the chemical sunscreens to work, they have to be absorbed into the skin where they absorb the ultraviolet light. Until they get into the skin, they don't function well. So those have to go on beforehand. Physical blockers will block the sunscreen immediately, and so as soon as you put them on, they are effective. There is a caveat to that also, that you want to put it on. My biggest concern is people go to the beach first and then first put on their sunscreen, and then they jump right in the water, in which case it all comes right off. So we tell everybody to put it on well beforehand so that it has time to get into the skin before you begin to sweat it off or have it rinse off in the water.
So that's interesting. I didn't realize that it actually has to penetrate the skin before it starts doing its magic. I guess I misunderstood the way that sunscreen works.
Just for the chemical sunscreens, that's true.
Yeah. How often should we be putting sunscreen back on if you're out at the beach for a day or you're out doing your gardening or going for a long bike ride or something like that? What do you think?
Most sunscreens will last about 3 to 4 hours. If you're in and out of the water, if you're perspiring heavily, less than that. And so depends on your activity. But if you are on the beach and dry and I would have reapplied it, every 3 hours. If you're out doing errands, every 3 hours. If you're exercising, if you're swimming or playing in and out of the water, you really need to reapply more often.
And we've been talking about sun exposure as if it were just a warm weather or a summer phenomenon, but you can get significant sun exposure at other times of the year as well, right?
You can, but that depends a lot on where you live and what you're doing. And so if you live in New York or points further north, the sun exposure we get in December, January, and February is really not that significant. And that's true because when you measure people's vitamin D levels, it goes down in the winter and it goes up in the summer. If you're going down to Florida, then it doesn't matter what time of year, you need to have it on. If there's snow on the ground, if you're going skiing, or even if you're here and you're going to take the kids out sled riding, the reflection off the snow is very significant. You need sunscreen on whatever skin is exposed then. I tell people if they really want to stop using the sunscreen in December, January, February, you can, as long as you put it on in the snow if you're traveling. But come March 1st, you have to get back into the routine. And that's where most people who stop the sunscreen really make the mistake. They don't really get rolling until the hot weather comes back.
Right.
It's best, be in the habit of putting it on in the morning and just use it all year long, and then you never have to worry about, starting to remember again.
Are there particular kinds of clothing that offer more protection or better in terms of overall protection from the sun than other kinds of clothing?
There's clothing in general is helpful, but if you take a lightweight T-shirt, a well-worn T-shirt, that has an SPF of 7. And so because you have a layer on doesn't mean that you're protected adequately. There are newer shirts that are out, these rash guard shirts that a lot of kids and adults now have to go to the beach that you can swim in. They're quick drying, and those give you very good protection. They are a complete block to the sun. So when you put on a shirt like that, it means there's a whole section of your body you don't need to grease up with the sunscreen. You need to worry about the exposed areas.
I see more and more little kids wearing these sort of beach shirts and long-sleeve beach shirts. That's a special fabric, you're saying?
It is. It's a fabric. They make that. It has more fibers per square inch than the normal clothing, and that's why it's very protective. But it's not just kids. They have them for adults, for men and women. I think we'll be seeing more and more of that. In addition, putting on a hat is really helpful. Finding the shade when you can. We go to the beach a lot, but we always bring an umbrella so that we can have a break from the sun. And sunglasses. Remember that the number one cause of cataracts and progression of macular degeneration is sun exposure. So sunglasses are really important too.
So it's not just about the look. It's about protecting your eyes as well.
The look isn't bad, but no, we want the protection.
We've obviously been talking almost exclusively about sun exposure. Are there other sort of healthy skin tips that you think are important for folks to keep in mind?
Well, yeah, in terms of trying to keep the skin healthy, sometimes, for people that do have some sun damage or really want to prevent a lot of sun damage, aside from using the sunscreens, some retinol preparations are very nice, or glycolic acid preparations are very good at trying to bring back, let's say to reverse some of the sun damage that's occurred over the years, try to prevent fine lines and even improve fine lines that come up. Realize that it doesn't make sense, though, to use products like that if you're not protecting yourself from the sun. So I always tell patients, if you're going to do one thing and one thing only for your skin, put on a sunscreen. The other things that you do are all in addition to that.
That really is a number one.
Yes, absolutely.
Where else can people go to get reliable information about skincare and sun safety?
I recommend a website by the American Academy of Dermatology. There's a website by the Skin Cancer Foundation, both of them who have a plethora of information. And we have a website as well, northwell.edu/dermatology, where they talk a lot about the different types of skin cancers and the various treatments.
Great. Any last words on how to keep our skin in good shape?
Moderation. Go out, enjoy the summer, but everything, like all good things, everything in moderation. So you want to keep the sun exposure limited, use the protection, keep a hat on, and I would add, get your COVID vaccine.
Okay, well, that's good advice for sure. Michael, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Ira, it's been a pleasure.
My guest has been Dr. Michael Dannenberg. For more information about this program and to find past episodes, please visit sites.hofstra.edu/wellsaid. You can also subscribe to our free podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Our listeners are welcome to send comments, suggestions, and questions to wellsaid@hofstra.edu. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ira Nash, and that's Well Said.